"We are moving in," my daughter-in-law announced before I even had time to set my teacup down. And in that quiet moment high in the Alps, with the snow melting off the cedar railing and the morning sun turning the mountains gold, I realized that kindness can sometimes sound like an invitation to the wrong people. The sound of gravel crunching under expensive tires had reached me a few seconds earlier, but I hadn't turned around right away. I was 71 years old, and after burying my husband 2 winters ago and selling the last house we had shared in Denver, I had finally learned to enjoy silence without rushing to fill it. The villa I had bought here sat alone on a slope that overlooked a valley so wide it made every worry seem smaller. Pine trees lined the long private drive, and a wrought iron gate marked the boundary between my life now and everything I had endured before. When the dark SUV stopped just beyond the stone fountain, I assumed it was a delivery or perhaps the caretaker checking in. I was not expecting to see Vanessa step out in a tailored cream coat that looked better suited for a Manhattan sidewalk than a mountain morning, followed by 2 movers carrying boxes I had never seen before. She did not wave. She did not smile. She simply stood there, hands on her hips, surveying the property as if she were already calculating how it could be rearranged to suit her. Daniel emerged from the passenger side more slowly, his eyes avoiding mine the way they had done more and more in recent years. For a long second none of us spoke. The wind lifted a strand of my silver hair, and somewhere down the valley, a church bell rang 10 times. Then Vanessa walked toward the terrace with the confidence of someone arriving at a long-awaited destination. "We are moving in," she said, her voice bright and decisive, as though she were announcing the start of a celebration. I remember noticing how carefully she pronounced each word, how she emphasized the word we, as if the decision had been unanimous. I set my teacup on the small round table beside me and folded my hands in my lap. The porcelain rattled softly against the saucer, betraying the only hint of surprise I allowed myself. This villa had been my secret promise to the future, a place where I could wake up to snow-capped peaks instead of memories, where the air smelled like pine instead of hospital disinfectant. I had spent months choosing every detail, from the wide plank oak floors to the antique brass fixtures in the kitchen, imagining quiet dinners and long afternoons with books I never had time to read before. Vanessa's heels clicked sharply on the stone tiles as she approached, her gaze already drifting past me toward the glass doors that led inside. "It's perfect," she said, not to me but to Daniel, who nodded as though he had rehearsed that gesture. "Plenty of space for when the kids visit. We can finally have the kind of home we deserve." The sentence hung in the cold mountain air like a fragile ornament. I noticed then the movers waiting expectantly near the entrance, their jackets dusted with snow, their expressions polite but curious. They did not know whose home this really was. Daniel cleared his throat and offered a small, apologetic smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mom, Vanessa thought it would be easier if we all stayed together for a while," he said, his tone careful like someone navigating thin ice. I studied his face, searching for the boy who used to run into my arms after school, who once swore he would never let anyone hurt me. Time has a way of editing promises. I stood up slowly, feeling the familiar steadiness return to my legs. The mountains had taught me something about endurance in these past months. Snow falls, storms pass, and the peaks remain exactly where they are. Vanessa was already reaching for the door handle when I picked up the heavy brass key from the table. For a brief second our eyes met. Hers were bright with anticipation. Mine, I suspect, were much quieter. I placed the key in her outstretched hand and smiled the kind of smile that confuses people who expect resistance. "Of course," I said gently. "Come in." Behind her, Daniel exhaled in visible relief. The movers sprang into action, carrying their boxes across the threshold, as if they were crossing into a prize they had won. Vanessa stepped inside first, her silhouette framed by sunlight and polished glass, and I followed at an unhurried pace, listening to the echo of our footsteps travel down the long marble hallway. Somewhere deep within the house, a sensor clicked on, activating a system that had been installed long before their arrival, a system designed not to keep strangers out, but to ensure that certain truths would eventually come to light. Vanessa paused just beyond the entryway, turning in a slow circle to take in the high ceilings, the sweeping staircase, the walls lined with photographs she had never seen. For the first time since stepping out of that SUV, she seemed unsure of herself. I watched quietly from behind, already aware that this moment was only the beginning, That sometimes the greatest strength lies not in closing a door but in opening it at exactly the right time. The first afternoon passed in a strange mixture of movement and stillness, as if the villa itself was deciding whether to accept its new occupants or quietly reject them. I remained near the tall arched window that overlooked the valley while Vanessa directed the movers with crisp, efficient gestures, her voice echoing through the marble corridors with the confidence of someone who believed she had already claimed victory. Boxes were stacked in the foyer, then rearranged, then opened with the sound of packing tape tearing like small impatient sighs. Daniel carried in a leather suitcase and set it down near the staircase, glancing toward me as though expecting a reaction that never came. Outside, clouds gathered slowly over the peaks, soft gray shapes that promised snow by nightfall. I had chosen this place for its distance from everything that used to define me. The nearest town was a 20-minute drive down a winding road lined with evergreens, and the closest neighbor was a retired schoolteacher who spent her mornings painting landscapes and her evenings reading by the fire. After my husband passed away, I had discovered that grief does not always shout. Sometimes it settles into your bones and becomes the rhythm of your days. Selling the house in Colorado had felt like peeling away the last layer of a life that no longer fit. The closing papers had been signed on a bright spring morning, and I remembered thinking how odd it was that the world could look so hopeful, while you were quietly dismantling everything you once built. Vanessa had not attended the sale. She had called instead, her tone sympathetic but distracted, asking practical questions about square footage and market value as though she were discussing an investment rather than a farewell. Now she walked through the villa with a measuring tape she had taken from one of the boxes, pausing at doorways, making notes on her phone, already envisioning changes. "This room could be a home office," she said to Daniel, gesturing toward the library I had spent weeks arranging with first editions and framed photographs. "We will need to update the furniture. It feels outdated." Daniel nodded again, his agreement as automatic as breathing. I wondered when he had learned to defer so completely. Years ago he had been stubborn, fiercely protective, the kind of child who would stand between me and a barking dog without hesitation. Marriage had not changed him all at once. It had happened gradually, like snow accumulating on a roof until the structure beneath it began to bend. I moved deeper into the house, listening to their footsteps behind me, aware of how sound carried differently here. Every corridor held an echo, every closed door suggested a secret waiting patiently to be discovered. The villa had a history long before I arrived. The realtor had mentioned that in passing, her voice lowering slightly as if she were sharing gossip. It had belonged to a diplomat once, then to an art collector who vanished without explanation. I had not asked many questions. I was not interested in other people's mysteries. I had enough of my own. In the kitchen, Vanessa opened cabinets and frowned at the copper cookware gleaming inside. "We will have to replace these," she said. "They look expensive, and I would hate for them to get scratched." There was something almost amusing about her concern. Daniel began unpacking dishes he had brought from their suburban home, lining them up on the counter beside mine as if trying to merge two separate worlds into one manageable arrangement. I poured myself another cup of tea and watched steam curl toward the ceiling beams. Control often announces itself in practical decisions. What stays, what goes, what must be improved. Vanessa thrived on that language. She spoke it fluently. Yet even as she moved from room to room, a faint hesitation had begun to creep into her movements. She noticed the discreet cameras mounted near the entrances. She tested the locked doors at the end of the West Wing hallway. She asked Daniel if I had mentioned anything about security codes or maintenance schedules. I answered her questions with polite clarity, offering just enough information to keep her comfortable. Outside, the first flakes of snow started to fall, light as ash, settling on the stone steps and the roof tiles that had witnessed decades of arrivals and departures. I realized then that the timing was almost perfect. Winter has a way of revealing who truly belongs in a place and who is merely passing through. Vanessa stood in the center of the living room, turning slowly as she had done earlier, her expression thoughtful now rather than triumphant. She was beginning to sense that this house operated by rules she did not yet understand, rules that could not be negotiated with charm or determination. I took a quiet sip of tea and allowed the silence to stretch between us, knowing that the deeper she stepped into my world, the closer she came to the truth she had never bothered to imagine. That evening the snow came down harder, covering the long driveway and softening the sharp outlines of the stone walls until the entire property looked like it had been wrapped in silence. I lit the fireplace in the main sitting room while Vanessa continued her slow inspection of the villa, her movements no longer brisk but measured, as though she had begun to realize that every step she took revealed something she had not expected. Daniel stood near the tall windows with his hands in his pockets, watching the snow fall with an expression that reminded me of the boy he used to be on winter mornings, restless and uncertain about what the day might bring. I set 3 place settings at the long oak dining table out of habit rather than necessity, aligning the silverware with quiet precision, allowing the small ritual to steady my thoughts. Vanessa finally joined us, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeves, her eyes lingering on the framed photographs that lined the far wall. They were not family portraits in the way she understood them. They showed distant landscapes, unfamiliar faces, moments frozen in places far beyond the suburbs she had always called home. "You never told us this house was so complicated," she said, choosing the last word carefully as she sat down. Her voice carried a note of curiosity now, tinged with something else she would never openly admit to feeling. I smiled faintly and poured her a glass of water from a crystal pitcher that had belonged to my husband. "Most things worth keeping are," I replied, and watched the way Daniel's shoulders stiffened at the mention of him. For a long time after the funeral, Daniel had avoided conversations about loss. Vanessa had filled the silence with practical plans, new routines, a life organized so efficiently that grief had no space to linger. I wondered if she believed she could do the same here. Dinner was simple: warm bread, roasted vegetables, a pot of soup that had simmered slowly throughout the afternoon. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters like a distant warning, and somewhere in the west wing a low mechanical hum began as the heating system adjusted to the dropping temperature. Vanessa glanced toward the sound, her brows knitting together. "Is that normal?" she asked. I nodded, taking my time before answering. "The house takes care of itself," I said, and let the statement settle between us. Daniel cleared his throat and asked about the security system, about access codes and backup generators, questions he framed as concern but which sounded suspiciously like attempts to map out control. I explained what was necessary and nothing more, describing the reinforced doors, the motion sensors, the timed locks that engaged automatically after midnight. Vanessa listened intently, her fingers resting on the table but no longer tapping with impatience. She had always thrived in environments she could predict. Here, prediction was a luxury she did not possess. After we finished eating, I rose to clear the dishes, but Vanessa surprised me by insisting she would handle it. She carried the plates to the kitchen with a determination that bordered on defiance, opening drawers, testing faucets, learning the rhythm of a space that had never been meant for her. I watched from the doorway, aware that this was how she claimed territory, through small acts of usefulness that slowly became authority. Daniel wandered down the hallway toward the west wing, drawn by curiosity he could no longer suppress. I heard the soft click of a locked door, followed by his voice calling my name with forced casualness. "Mom, what is in this room?" I walked toward him without hurrying, my slippers whispering against the polished floor. The corridor lights brightened automatically as I approached, illuminating the intricate carvings on the wooden panels that framed the door. "Something important," I said simply. Vanessa appeared behind us, drying her hands on a linen towel, her gaze moving from Daniel's face to mine. For the first time since arriving, she did not try to mask the uncertainty in her eyes. Snow continued to fall beyond the tall windows, sealing us inside a world that felt increasingly separate from everything she had planned. I placed my palm against the cool brass handle but did not turn it. Timing, I had learned, was everything. There are truths that must be revealed gradually, like the slow unveiling of a landscape at dawn. Vanessa took a small step back, as though instinctively recognizing that she was standing at the edge of something she could not yet name. I let the silence stretch again, long enough for anticipation to grow roots, and then I smiled in the same calm way I had greeted her at the door, certain that the deeper she allowed herself to settle into this place, the more impossible it would become for her to pretend she had ever belonged here at all. Morning arrived with a pale silver light that filtered through the tall windows and settled across the marble floors like a quiet promise. I woke before the others, as I always did, and moved through the villa with the familiarity of someone who had already made peace with its shadows and its secrets. The heating system hummed softly behind the walls, and the faint scent of pine drifted in from the half-open balcony doors. For a moment I stood there wrapped in a wool shawl, watching mist rise from the valley and thinking about how easily people mistake possession for belonging. Vanessa had always believed that acquiring something was the same as understanding it. Houses, relationships, opportunities. She approached them all with the same polished certainty, convinced that determination could rewrite history. Down the hallway I could hear the muted rhythm of her footsteps. She had not slept well. I could tell from the uneven pace, from the way she paused at each doorway as if listening for an answer she had not yet learned how to ask. Daniel remained in the guest room we had prepared the night before, his suitcase still unopened, his presence here suspended somewhere between loyalty and regret. I set the coffee maker to brew and laid out breakfast with the quiet efficiency that had once defined my mornings as a young mother. There is comfort in routine even when everything else feels uncertain. Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing a sweater she had likely purchased for this trip, soft cashmere in a shade that matched the winter sky. Her smile was courteous but thinner than it had been yesterday. "I could not find the light switch in the west wing," she said without preamble. I handed her a cup of coffee and gestured toward the long table where sunlight had begun to stretch across the polished surface. "Some rooms prefer darkness until they are ready," I replied, and watched her absorb the words without fully grasping them. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his hair still damp from the shower, his expression guarded. He spoke about the snow clearing service, about whether the road would remain accessible if the storm worsened. Practical concerns always made him feel safer. I assured him that the caretaker monitored weather patterns closely, and that the villa had been designed to withstand far harsher conditions than a late-season snowfall. Vanessa listened in silence, her gaze drifting repeatedly toward the corridor that led to the locked door. Curiosity had replaced confidence now, and curiosity can be a powerful force when it is denied satisfaction. After breakfast she announced that she wanted to explore the grounds, to see the property lines and the small outbuildings the realtor had mentioned in passing. I agreed at once, offering her a heavy coat and boots that had once belonged to my husband. She hesitated before accepting them, as though aware that wearing something of his carried a meaning she could not easily define. Outside, the world had transformed overnight into a landscape of white and glass. Snow clung to the branches in delicate layers, and the fountain at the end of the drive had frozen into a sculpture of silent motion. We walked slowly along the path, our breaths visible in the cold air, the crunch of our footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. Vanessa asked questions about maintenance costs, about property taxes in a foreign country, about how often I intended to travel back to the United States. I answered each one with calm precision, allowing her to build her own narrative from the fragments I provided. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks as if searching for guidance. When we reached the edge of the property, where a low stone wall marked the boundary between my land and the untouched forest beyond, Vanessa stopped walking. She turned to face the villa rising above us, its windows catching the morning light, its silhouette both inviting and formidable. "It feels like it is watching us," she said softly, and for the first time there was no ambition in her voice, only uncertainty. I studied her profile, the sharp intelligence that had once impressed me now clouded by doubt. "Houses remember," I told her, my tone gentle but firm. "They remember who built them, who cared for them, and who tried to change them before they understood what they were meant to protect." She did not respond. Instead she pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders and began the slow walk back, each step measured, as though she were recalculating the distance between her expectations and the reality unfolding around her. I followed at an unhurried pace, aware that the deeper winter settled over the mountains, the less room there would be for illusions to survive. By the second afternoon the villa had begun to feel different, not because anything visible had changed, but because the air itself carried a quiet tension that even Daniel could no longer pretend not to notice. Snow continued to fall in slow deliberate sheets, sealing the long driveway beneath layers of white that glowed faintly under the gray sky. I spent the morning in the study reviewing correspondence and financial statements that had been forwarded from my attorney in New York, documents that required attention but not urgency. Vanessa, however, had discovered a new purpose. She moved through the rooms with a notebook in her hand, making lists in tight, efficient handwriting, pausing occasionally to take photographs on her phone as if gathering evidence for a future she still believed she could control. I watched her from the doorway of the library, while she measured the length of the window frames and calculated how much light the room would receive in spring. "We could turn this into a guest suite," she said aloud, though Daniel was nowhere nearby to hear her. Her voice sounded smaller against the high ceilings, as though the villa absorbed her certainty and returned only an echo. Later she asked about local contractors, about renovation permits, about whether the electrical system could support a complete redesign of the upper floor. I answered each question with patient clarity, allowing her to believe she was building momentum. Daniel spent most of the day wandering from one space to another, his restlessness visible in the way he checked his watch, in the half-finished attempts to help her unpack. At one point he stepped outside to make a phone call, his words carried back to me by the cold wind as he spoke to someone about timelines and expectations. I did not need to hear every sentence to understand the shape of his concerns. Control has a cost, and he was beginning to calculate it. In the late afternoon, Vanessa announced that she intended to organize the West Wing storage rooms, insisting that unused space was wasteful. She located a set of keys on the kitchen counter and began testing them one by one, her determination returning now that she had a task she could define. I followed at a distance, my footsteps quiet against the corridor rugs, aware that the moment she had been approaching since her arrival was finally within reach. The first door opened easily, revealing shelves of neatly labeled boxes containing winter blankets and antique tableware. The second led to a small office where a desk faced a wall of filing cabinets, each drawer locked and numbered. Vanessa's eyes brightened at the sight, her curiosity sharpened by the promise of discovery. "You keep excellent records," she remarked, running her fingers along the cool metal handles. "That is wise at your age." I smiled at the unintended honesty of her comment. Wisdom, I had learned, is rarely appreciated until it becomes inconvenient. She moved to the third door, the one Daniel had tried the night before, and inserted another key with a confidence that bordered on impatience. For a moment nothing happened. Then there was a soft mechanical click, followed by the subtle shift of internal bolts releasing in sequence. The sound was almost musical, a quiet overture signaling that the villa had decided to reveal one of its many guarded truths. Vanessa pushed the door open slowly, stepping across the threshold into a room illuminated by a single skylight where sunlight filtered through drifting snowflakes above. She stopped moving. I could see the exact instant when her certainty faltered, when the narrative she had constructed in her mind began to fracture under the weight of reality. Daniel appeared beside her, drawn by the silence that had replaced her usual commentary. Inside the room stood a long polished table covered with documents, sealed envelopes, and framed legal certifications bearing dates and signatures from countries she had only ever visited on vacation. Cameras mounted discreetly in the corners recorded every movement with patient precision. At the far end of the table rested a leather portfolio embossed with my full name, the edges worn from years of careful handling. Vanessa's breath caught, barely audible, yet louder than any protest she could have voiced. She turned toward me then, searching my face for reassurance or explanation, perhaps even for permission to retreat. I remained where I was, framed by the doorway, my expression calm and unreadable. Outside, the storm intensified, wind sweeping across the roof like a hand closing over a secret. Some lessons cannot be softened. Some revelations must arrive exactly when they are needed most. Vanessa took a single step backward, the notebook slipping from her grasp to the floor, its pages scattering like quiet confessions across the polished wood. In that moment she understood that this house had never been an opportunity waiting to be claimed. It had been a safeguard waiting to be activated. Vanessa did not speak for a long time after the notebook slipped from her hands, and in that fragile silence I could almost hear the precise moment when her confidence began to unravel into something far less comfortable. Daniel stepped into the room beside her, his shoes making a hollow sound against the polished floor, his gaze moving quickly from the documents on the table to the discreet cameras mounted near the ceiling. He reached out as if to touch one of the framed certificates but stopped himself midway, the hesitation revealing more than any question he might have asked. I remained in the doorway, allowing them space to absorb what they were seeing, understanding that revelation is rarely effective when forced. Outside, The wind rose with a low persistent howl that pressed against the thick stone walls like an argument that refused to be dismissed. Vanessa finally bent down to gather her scattered pages, her movements slower now, careful as though she feared that even the smallest misstep might trigger consequences she could not predict. "What is all this?" she asked, not turning toward me, her voice stripped of its usual authority. I walked into the room with measured calm and rested my fingertips lightly on the leather portfolio bearing my name. The surface was worn smooth from years of preparation, from quiet decisions made long before she had ever imagined crossing this threshold. "Protection," I said simply. Daniel exhaled sharply, the sound catching in his throat as realization began to take shape. He opened one of the envelopes and scanned the dense legal language inside, his brow tightening as he moved from page to page. Trust agreements, international property filings, clauses outlining conditions that could not be reversed once activated. He looked up at me then, truly seeing me for the first time since he had stepped out of that SUV. "You planned this," he murmured, not with accusation but with dawning comprehension. I met his gaze without flinching. Planning had been the only language grief had allowed me to speak. After my husband died, I had learned that love does not always leave you with comfort. Sometimes it leaves you with instructions. Vanessa straightened slowly, clutching her notebook against her chest like a shield she no longer trusted. "You never told us any of this," she said. Her tone was careful again, but beneath the composure I could hear the tremor of uncertainty she had spent years avoiding. I moved toward the skylight where snowflakes drifted past in endless quiet patterns, their soft descent reminding me how easily the world continues even when personal narratives collapse. "You never asked," I replied. The words were not cruel. They were merely accurate. Daniel set the documents back on the table with unusual gentleness, as though he feared disturbing something that might still decide his future. He began to ask practical questions then about legal access, about whether his name appeared anywhere in the agreements, about what would happen if circumstances changed. Vanessa listened intently, her earlier ambition replaced by a sharper instinct for survival. She had always been quick to adapt when power shifted. I explained that the villa existed within a structure, designed to ensure its purpose could not be altered by convenience or persuasion. Ownership was not the same as influence. Residency was not the same as authority. The cameras were not there to intimidate but to document, to provide clarity when memory and intention inevitably diverged. Vanessa's eyes moved around the room again, lingering on the neat rows of files, on the careful organization that spoke of years spent anticipating a confrontation no one else had believed would occur. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. I folded my hands in front of me, feeling the steady warmth of resolve settle once more into my bones. Outside, the storm intensified, sealing the long driveway beneath another layer of snow that would take days to clear. "Now," I said, "we allow time to reveal who is truly prepared to stay." Daniel glanced toward the corridor as if calculating the distance back to the life he had assumed would continue unchanged. Vanessa said nothing further. For the first time since she had arrived, she understood that this house was not something she could renovate, negotiate, or redefine. It was a boundary she would have to learn to respect or leave behind. And as the lights adjusted automatically to the fading afternoon, casting long deliberate shadows across the table of documents, I realized that the moment I had quietly prepared for had finally begun to unfold exactly as it was meant to. That night none of us spoke about leaving, and yet the possibility lingered in every room like a question no one wanted to ask aloud. The storm had grown heavier by evening, turning the windows into pale mirrors that reflected our movements back at us in softened shapes. I sat near the fireplace with a book open in my lap, though I had not turned a page in nearly an hour. Vanessa moved quietly through the villa, her earlier urgency replaced by a careful awareness of boundaries she had not previously believed existed. Daniel spent a long time in the study reviewing the documents again, his shoulders hunched forward, his expression shadowed by calculations he had never imagined he would need to make about his own mother. There are moments in life when roles shift so subtly that you only recognize the change after it has already taken hold. For years I had been the one who accommodated, who adjusted her expectations to maintain peace. Now peace requires something very different. Vanessa eventually approached the fireplace and stood beside me, her hands clasped loosely as though she were trying to warm herself without admitting she felt cold. "You could have trusted us," she said softly, the words sounding more like a memory of how she used to speak than a reflection of how she felt now. I closed the book and rested it on the side table, taking a moment to consider the weight of what she was asking. Trust had never been a single decision. It had been a series of small tests, each one quietly observed, each one remembered. "I did," I replied, "until I realized trust should not require surrender." Daniel looked up from across the room, his eyes searching mine for reassurance that might no longer be mine to give. He had always believed that families were permanent structures, immune to the slow erosion of ambition and fear. Vanessa sat down at last, the tension in her posture easing into something closer to reflection. She spoke about their plans back home, about the mortgage they had taken on, about how she had imagined this villa as a solution to problems she had never fully explained. Her voice carried none of its usual sharpness. Instead it sounded thoughtful, almost fragile. I listened without interruption, understanding that the truth people offer when they feel uncertain is often more revealing than any confession forced from them. Outside, snow continued to gather along the balconies and the stone steps, sealing us deeper into a shared space that demanded honesty in ways suburban routines never had. Later Daniel asked if we could all sit together in the morning to discuss practical arrangements. His tone was respectful now, measured in a way that acknowledged he no longer held the assumptions he had brought with him. I agreed without hesitation. Agreements, I had learned, are strongest when they are made after illusions have dissolved. Vanessa lingered by the window before retiring for the night, watching the drifting flakes as though they might deliver an answer if she waited long enough. The cameras in the corridor recorded our quiet departures, their presence no longer unsettling, but simply part of the villa's rhythm. In my bedroom I folded the wool shawl over the back of a chair, and stood for a long moment facing the darkness beyond the glass. There is a certain clarity that arrives when you realize you have prepared not out of fear but out of respect for your own future. Morning would bring decisions, perhaps even apologies. But for now the house held us all in a patient stillness, allowing each of us to reconsider the roles we had so confidently assigned ourselves. Somewhere down the hallway a door closed with gentle finality. I returned to the bed and switched off the lamp, knowing that whatever came next would not be dictated by habit or expectation but by the quiet strength I had finally learned to claim as my own. Morning arrived quietly after the long storm, bringing a pale blue sky that stretched across the mountains like a promise no one had yet decided to trust. I was already in the kitchen when Daniel entered, his steps slower than usual, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. He poured himself coffee without speaking, watching the steam rise as if it might organize his thoughts into something easier to say. Vanessa joined us a few minutes later, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger, less certain of the role she had rehearsed for so many years. None of us rushed the conversation. The villa seemed to encourage patience, as though time itself moved differently within its walls. Finally Daniel cleared his throat and asked if we could review the documents together again, this time with the intention of understanding rather than resisting. I nodded and led them back to the West Wing room, where sunlight now filtered through the skylight and illuminated the long table like a stage prepared for quiet revelations. Vanessa took her seat carefully, smoothing the front of her sweater as if preparing for a negotiation she could not yet define. Daniel opened the leather portfolio and began reading aloud sections that outlined the structure of the trust, the provisions that protected the property from forced transfer, the clauses that activated specific safeguards if ownership was ever challenged. His voice faltered occasionally, not from confusion but from recognition. I watched as comprehension settled over him in layers, each one dissolving an assumption he had carried for too long. Vanessa listened intently, her gaze moving from the printed words to my face and back again, searching for a weakness she had once relied upon. Instead she found only steadiness. Outside, the snow began to melt along the edges of the terrace, droplets sliding down the stone like the slow release of tension that had defined our arrival. At one point Vanessa asked whether any of the agreements could be amended, whether circumstances might allow for shared authority in the future. I answered her honestly. Some protections were designed not to exclude but to clarify. This villa had never been a symbol of isolation. It was a declaration that dignity required structure. Daniel leaned back in his chair then, exhaling deeply as though he had finally reached the end of a long internal argument. He spoke about responsibility, about the ways he had allowed convenience to guide decisions that should have been rooted in respect. His words were careful but sincere, shaped by the realization that independence does not diminish family. Vanessa remained quiet for a while after that, her fingers tracing the grain of the table, her ambition recalibrating into something more reflective. She admitted that she had imagined this place as an opportunity to solve financial pressures she had never fully shared, to create a sense of control that would make the future feel less uncertain. I listened without judgment. Fear often disguises itself as entitlement. The villa, with its hidden systems and deliberate boundaries, had simply revealed the difference. When we finished reviewing the documents, Daniel closed the portfolio and met my eyes with a clarity that had been missing for years. He said they would need time to decide their next steps, that leaving immediately might not be practical while the road remained buried under snow. I agreed, offering the same calm hospitality I had extended from the beginning. Decisions made in haste rarely endure. Vanessa stood and walked to the skylight, watching the last flakes drift away in the warming air. For the first time since she had stepped onto the terrace, her shoulders relaxed. She was beginning to understand that belonging could not be claimed through strategy alone. It required acceptance of limits as much as ambition. We left the room together, the cameras recording our departure with quiet impartiality. In the hallway, the afternoon light stretched long across the floor, guiding us back toward the living spaces where ordinary routines waited to be redefined. Somewhere within the villa, a door unlocked automatically as the system adjusted to the changing weather. A subtle reminder that protection and freedom often exist side by side. I realized then that whatever choices Daniel and Vanessa made in the coming days, the balance of our relationship had already shifted. Not through confrontation, but through the simple act of standing firm in a place I had finally made my own. On the third morning, the road finally began to reappear beneath the slow, determined work of the snow-clearing crew, their machines carving narrow dark lines through the white silence that had held us together for what felt like far longer than a few days. I stood on the balcony wrapped in the same wool shawl, watching the sun lift itself over the mountains with a confidence I had once believed belonged only to younger people. Inside the villa, I could hear Daniel moving through the hallway, opening and closing drawers with the quiet efficiency of someone preparing to leave. Vanessa followed him, her footsteps lighter now, no longer sharp with intention but softened by reflection she could not easily dismiss. When they joined me outside, neither of them spoke immediately. The valley stretched below us in clear winter light, every tree and rooftop outlined with delicate precision, as if the world itself had been redrawn overnight. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice steady but carrying the weight of understanding that had taken him years to reach. He said they had decided to return home once the road was fully cleared, that there were responsibilities waiting for them, conversations they needed to have, changes they could no longer postpone. I listened without interrupting, aware that departure can be as meaningful as arrival when it is chosen rather than forced. Vanessa met my eyes then, and for the first time since stepping out of that SUV, she did not look at me as an obstacle or an opportunity. She looked at me as a person whose strength she had underestimated. She spoke about gratitude, about how the villa had revealed more than she had expected, about how control had once felt like the only way to protect the life she was trying to build. Her words were careful but genuine, shaped by the realization that influence without respect eventually collapses under its own weight. I accepted her honesty with the same calm I had offered from the beginning. There was no triumph in this moment, only clarity. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small envelope containing the keys he had borrowed during their stay, placing them in my palm with a gesture that carried both apology and acknowledgement. He said he understood now that independence was not rejection, that boundaries could exist without breaking family. The cameras above the terrace door recorded the exchange with quiet indifference, their purpose fulfilled not through confrontation but through documentation of change. Snow melted steadily along the stone steps as we walked back inside to gather their belongings, the villa already adjusting to the idea of fewer footsteps, fewer expectations pressing against its walls. Vanessa paused in the West Wing corridor one last time, glancing toward the door she had once tried to claim as part of her future. She did not attempt to open it again. Some doors, once understood, no longer invite intrusion. When the SUV finally rolled down the cleared driveway later that afternoon, its dark shape shrinking against the brightness of the snow, I remained on the terrace until it disappeared completely around the bend. The mountains stood unchanged, patient witnesses to departures that mattered less to them than they did to us. Inside, the villa settled back into its natural rhythm, lights dimming automatically as the sun began its slow descent. I returned to the long table in the west wing and closed the leather portfolio with deliberate care, feeling a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with self-respect. For the first time in many years, I understood that protecting your peace does not require loud declarations or dramatic endings. Sometimes it is enough to stand still while others learn where the true boundaries have always been. As evening fell and the first stars appeared above the darkening peaks, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the last traces of snow melt into memory, certain that whatever tomorrow might bring, this place would remain exactly what I had intended it to be from the very beginning.